For the month of November, we have been talking about the concept or the practice of forgiveness and how important forgiveness is to our well-being and our spiritual growth. Forgiveness is an attribute of God. Forgiveness was consistently demonstrated by Jesus Christ. Forgiveness is also something we strive for both individually and as a church. Yet forgiveness is not always easy for us. It sounds easy, but when it comes to the practical applications of forgiveness, we often have a lot of questions. And in today's text from the Gospel of Matthew, Peter has questions. I mean, there must be a limit on forgiveness, right? I mean, you can't just forgive everything. You can't forgive forever. So Peter approaches Jesus and says, okay, hey, so I get this forgiveness thing. But if a church member, say, sins against me, I mean, I know we're supposed to forgive them, but what if it happens? What if it keeps happening? I mean, how many times are we supposed to forgive somebody? I mean, 7 times? I mean, give me a break. I mean, how many times? Come on. I mean, that's got to be a reasonable limit, right? Although consider, people in ancient times perceived numbers very differently compared to today. So today, when we think of numbers, we hear the 7, right? 7 times, and we think of 7 times. We think of a magnitude or a quantity when we hear the number 7. We think of 7 items. But in ancient times, numbers were perceived in more symbolic terms, more mystical terms, even artistic symbols that represented something far more than just quantity. The original audience would have perceived the number 7 as special. There's a reason Peter picked 7. That number rather than, say, 8 or 6. The number 7 was a symbol of perfection. Are you aware of this? This is something you've heard of before? It was a sacred number. So while we hear the number 7 is between 5 and 10, ancient people would have heard the number 7 as a symbolic representation of completeness, of perfection, of beauty. So Peter is symbolically asking Jesus if we should forgive others in a complete and perfect way. 7 times. Then we're done. And that's the way the original audience would have heard it. And Jesus responds, not 7, but 77, or some translations say 7 times 7, or 70 times 7. Jesus responds that he's talking about not just perfect forgiveness, but forgiveness beyond perfect. Not just a mathematical message, it's a symbolic one. To the modern mind, only able to grasp numbers in terms of quantity, 77 is a medium number, one that we could probably keep track of. That's it. You've messed up 76 times. One more and you're out. So that's the way the modern mind. But in ancient times, the size of the number was kind of a secondary consideration. It was there. It was part of the message. 2 sevens was not about the number 77 as much as it's more like a double dose of perfection. So if all we can do is perceive the number 7 as a quantity or a size, we'll miss the message of perfect that was being conveyed in Peter's conversation with Jesus. So forgiving 77 times was perfect forgiveness. And perfect forgiveness is not defined by the number of times that we forgive. That's not the only consideration, the only factor. For example, perfect forgiveness does not mean you forgive in such a way that you subject yourself or others to repeated abuse. Right? We've talked about that. Remember that we have to be safe before we can forgive. We don't forgive in such a way that subjects anyone to repeated abuse. And this isn't a theoretical concern. This has happened time and again. For example, historically, churches have too often advised women to repeatedly forgive abusive husbands, leaving them trapped in a cycle of violence that repeats over and over again. That's not perfect forgiveness. Repeatedly forgiving someone as part of a cycle of domestic violence would not have been what Jesus had in mind here, or Peter. When Jesus says to forgive not just perfectly, but beyond perfectly, He wouldn't have intended to enable abuse of any kind. But as Peter's question suggests, people have difficulty forgiving each other one time, much less 7. So this represents a huge spiritual challenge, one that must be dealt with if we're going to live as an expression of love, rather than live life as a grudge match, which can happen if we do not forgive each other. How many times should we forgive small offenses in the modern world? Not 77 times, I tell you, but 1,000,000 times. Now, we don't know the nature of the infraction that Peter's talking about here that requires forgiveness. We don't know if it's something small. But in responding to Peter, Jesus doesn't focus on minor offenses on his teaching. No, instead, Jesus focuses on a huge issue when it comes to people forgiving each other: money. Jesus focuses on debt by telling what's known as the parable of the unforgiving servant, which we just heard. Jesus teaches directly about forgiving those who borrow money, because that's the forgiveness that people struggle with the most. At least it did in Jesus' time. That's still true today? You have trouble forgiving somebody that wouldn't pay you back that $100 you gave them last week? Well, in ancient times, and today as well, that's one of the biggest forgiveness issues we have to deal with. And it was a much bigger problem in ancient times, because in ancient times, not paying back your debt had terrible consequences. In much of our human history, wealth has been considered as more important than humanity, more important than just about anything. In the not too distant past, just a few hundred years ago, if you did not pay your debt on time, and it could be just a small amount, your body, could be sold. Your family could be enslaved to the person who lent you the money. Wealthy people would sometimes entrap the poor with generous loans that were offered with the sole purpose of enslavement, knowing that it would be nearly impossible for the individual to pay it back in the agreed upon time frame. That's the context for the parable of the unforgiving servant. And this was the kind of debt that Jesus witnessed in his day-to-day life. It's not forgiveness of small sins that's our biggest problem. It's forgiveness of debt. Right after Peter asks Jesus about how often to forgive others, Jesus tells the story or parable to teach Peter and to teach us about forgiveness. Jesus used parables a lot to teach and to reveal truths that might otherwise be hard to see. Parables, as you probably remember, are not intended to represent a literal or actual account of something that really happened. Parables are fictional stories that Jesus makes up to illustrate a moral or spiritual message. This particular parable is a pretty extreme story, one that includes features that we're going to miss as modern people because we're in a different context than ancient people. But at the heart of the story, it's the question of debt. How much debt can be forgiven? It's a similar question to how many times I should forgive, but with a far deeper social justice implication, particularly between the rich and the poor. How much can I possibly forgive before I take legal action against the borrower? It's a parable, so we know the symbolic meanings abound and that the literal interpretation is just one dimension of the story. For those who've experienced in drama or in plays, Jesus tells this parable in effectively 3 acts or 3 scenes. Each scene is about the relationship between someone with power, in this case financial power, and someone who's poor, someone who's in debt. The parable begins with the king talking to his servant who is hopelessly indebted to a ridiculous degree. To the modern mind, the amount of the servant's debt, 10,000 talents, might not sound like all that much, but to the ancient reader, to the original audience, it would have been understood as an impossibly large amount of money. To the ancient mind, this number is intended to represent like $1 billion. So the king brings his servant up and says, "Hey, you owe me $1 billion, pay up." That's the way the story would have been understood to the original audience. Ancient readers would know both that it would have been impossible for a servant to owe that much to begin with, and even more impossible for him to ever pay it back. It's very likely that the servant has been snookered, has been somehow fooled into accepting such an impossible and ridiculous amount of debt. A practice that Jesus actually saw likely in his day-to-day life. It's such a ridiculous amount of money that it's assumed that no one in their right mind could even forgive so much. You couldn't owe that much, you couldn't forgive that much either. So at first, the king in our parable is going to try and get at least a little bit back. He's going to enslave the man and his family, get a tiny fraction of what's owed. The servant falls on his knees. Please, you're talking about my life here, my family. I've got kids. I need more time. But they both know more time it's not going to make any difference. The king does not accept the impossible request for more time. Instead, the king forgives beyond perfectly, canceling the billion-dollar debt. Symbolically, who is the king in this story? God. And the servants represents who? Us. You guys are pretty good at this. Yeah. Maybe Jesus is saying that God's plan for forgiveness is that big. It's $1 billion big. Maybe bigger than all the money of the world at that time. Thus ends Act 1. Act 2 of the parable starts as the servant leaves. Act 2 is a repeat of Act 1 with a twist. The servant, now totally forgiven of $1 billion debt, goes out and decides to immediately collect on a much smaller amount. The amount owed to the servant by a fellow servant was maybe about 4 months' wages. So not an insignificant amount, but unlike $1 billion, one that could realistically be repaid over time. The servant grabs the poor guy that owes him money by the neck. And when he cries out for mercy, unlike what happened in Act 1, this time mercy is denied. The servant treats his peer much worse than he was treated by the king. This part of the parable represents how we as regular people treat each other. When it comes to forgiveness of debt, we treat each other far more harshly than we're treated by God. Jesus lays God's actions, human actions, next to God's actions, which is literally what the word parable means. Kingdom of heaven, kingdom of earth. What the king did, what the servant did. Few humans would be willing to forgive 4 months of wages. Jesus shows his deep understanding of what's really happening in the society around him in regard to debt, in regard to what's causing the most pain and suffering in the community. Much of society in Jesus' day ignored Old Testament rules about Sabbath and Jubilee, about forgiving debt and treatment of the poor. The poor are supposed to be treated with grace and with compassion and with generosity. In ancient times, though, failure to pay back debt destroyed the debtor's life, generally leading to their death as an incarcerated slave. Act 3 opens with the other servants watching this, seeing what happens, seeing how the king forgave, and watching how that same servant did not forgive. So they go back to the king, whispers, "Hey, king, did you see what this guy did? Can you believe that?" So the king's pretty upset. He calls him back in. "Is this true?" "It is." "You're a wicked man." The king cannot believe, after receiving forgiveness for $1 billion, that this guy acted in this way. So the king hands the man over to be tortured until his entire impossibly large debt could be repaid. which would be never. Then Jesus closes the parable with a warning that God will do the same to us if we do not forgive others from our hearts. In other words, that God might treat us as poorly as we treat each other. Ouch. Ouch. Parables are famous for having multiple meanings depending on where we are at on our spiritual journey. To me personally, this parable demonstrates that in God's eyes, humans are worth more than any amount of money. Money and wealth have a specific purpose, and that purpose is not to enslave or deprive people of their basic needs. Debt can too easily become a weapon against the weak, the sick, and the powerless when wealth and greed are an individual's or a society's highest value. And that's a message we hear a lot in the Bible, and particularly in the book or the Gospel of Matthew in particular. Systems of indebtedness are rarely set up in ways that benefit the poor. Instead, debt and repayment systems are typically set up in a way that suggests it's the wealthy who need protection from the poor. Have you ever noticed that? That debt and repayment systems are set up in a way that assumes it's the wealthy who need protection, not the poor. But Jesus inverts that reasoning, directly connecting the importance of forgiveness with debt in this parable. This parable also opens up the question of what, if anything, is unforgivable. In this story, being in debt $1 billion was totally forgivable by the king, giving a degree of humility and a request for mercy. However, failing to forgive others, as we have been forgiven, was not forgivable by the king. The servant's failure to forgive his fellow servant was what led to his punishment. The king in this story represents God, and notice how God responded to honest pleas for leniency, how gracious God was, even to the point of forgiving an unbelievably huge debt. But the servant, representing humans, was unforgiving when it came to a debt, and that's what led to God calling him wicked. Now, not to soften things, but I don't think the message here is forgive or be damned. And I don't think it's forgive or else, although I understand why some would see it that way. I see it more as a reminder that God does not treat us like we treat each other. And despite the literal reading of how this paradise parable ends, I would say that in some cases, God's forgiveness is so deep, it's so loving, it's so big that it even includes forgiving those who can't forgive. That's my contention. It's not exactly what the parable says. Because God's forgiveness, in my opinion, is that big. God has forgiven and promises to forgive more than we can even imagine. Yes, it's important that we forgive. Our inability to forgive other people's debt and our inability to forgive ourselves illustrates a distance between us and God. And that distance, that separation from God, means that we have to make intentional effort to learn to forgive more often, more completely, and more perfectly. Once we are living in accordance to God's will, once that distance is reduced, forgiveness becomes much easier. It becomes natural. When we gain a certain level of spiritual maturity, we become a walking example of forgiveness. I don't know if any of us are quite there yet, but our spiritual path leads in that direction. To forgive not just perfectly, but beyond perfectly.